it's 6 on this one.
Yeah, it is. Okay. We'll go ahead and call the Port Hueneme City Council special meeting to order here on Monday, April the 9th, 2018 at 6 p.m. And with that, could we have the roll call, Madam City Clerk?
Councilmember Fig?
Here.
Councilmember Hensley? Councilmember Sharkey?
Present.
Mayor Pro Tem Berg? Mayor Schnapp?
Present, and I understand that both Councilmember Hensley and Mayor Pro Tem Berg have another event that they're at, so it's an
Which we all could have gone to, I guess, if we wanted to.
We did, and I actually then canceled with the group because I knew we had this meeting. Okay, so there's 3 of us, which is a quorum. We have the agenda in front of us as item number 2.
Move to approve.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
Okay, all those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? All right, so motion to approve the agenda carries. We have open forum that we are reserving 10 minutes for, and this is when the council hears public comments on matters that are not on the agenda. And I do have a speaker card here from Ken Rifkind. Okay, Ken, so you can come up and you have 3 minutes.
All right. What do they say on talk radio? Long-time listener, first-time caller. I've watched you all on YouTube very often, but here you are in person. My name is Ken Rifkin. I moved to Port Hueneme in 2015. My wife and I chose a home here because of the quiet, charming, unspoiled beaches. We looked in Long Beach, and it's just all these high-rises and traffic, crime, so that's why we chose here. I do want to thank the council for their diligence in trying to find a solution to the budget deficit, the structural deficit. But what I came here tonight is to ask you a question. 10 years from now, what will you be remembered for as a council? Will you be remembered for your efforts to balance the budget? Or will you be remembered for the council that literally sold out and commercialized the beach and sold a significant amount of the public beach for this project? This project is going to have quite a bit of social media attention because we are in that social media age, and it will have a lot of the attention of a lot of environmental groups. So this will, I promise you, this will be big, not because of me and not even because of the local neighborhoods here, but this will be big. And how many of you are fans of Joni Mitchell? Big Yellow Taxi? There's a line in that song that says they paved paradise and they put up a parking lot. And I just don't, I know it's not easy to balance a budget, and I know hard decisions have to be made, but is that the legacy? Do we want to pass along a balanced budget and no beach, or do we want to pass the beach along to future generations? Again, thank you for your time and your service.
Thank you. All right, is there anyone wishing to speak to the council on matters not on the agenda? All right, seeing none, we have item number 4, community development, and it's about our municipal code update workshop. So are you going to take care of that, Mr. Stewart?
I am going to do so.
Okay.
At least I hope to do so. So thank you and good evening. So a couple of quick housekeeping items. Hopefully this will take no more than a couple of hours. I've, based on Mayor Schnapp's past comments, have tried to condense this into 3 workshops, and we can discuss the upcoming workshop dates towards the end here. I've broken this up into a couple of different segments. We've got basically 3 natural places to stop, so it just depends on where we are at the end of the first or second, or basically how long you want to go on this evening. So also with regard to how I've set this up is I've got the first few slides are truly just housekeeping items, and I don't know, I mean, I put them up there basically for just on, being cautious. But if you don't want to necessarily weigh in on these informational items, because there are no policy direction, there is no policy direction needed on these first few slides, we can simply just move on and get into the more beefier items as we come along in the evening. So basically the purpose of the project, there's several items that we're looking at here this evening. One is just to simply streamline and make the code a little bit more business friendly. But also we have a few new recent state standards primarily dealing with housing regulations that we will get into in the subsequent workshops. In fact, the next workshop we have will be discussing accessory dwelling units as well as density bonus and how we tie in our ordinances with what the state's now mandating we do. As I reminded you in the past, time is not of the essence, so we'll take as long as we need to. And keep in mind that these are all suggestions. Obviously, like I said, with regard to the state mandates, they are suggestions on how to comply. But these are not necessarily recommendations. We're not tied to any of these. Feel free to add additional items or let me know if our current code standards are good as is. When going through this, knowing that the city is built out, and I'm not the type of person that really likes to fix something that isn't broken, for the most part, if a standard has been working out just fine, they've not been suggested for change at all. But based on having a relatively new staff and just with public input, some of these suggestions are being brought before you here in these next couple of workshops. What I do want to go over real quick too is what we're not proposing to change with regard to zoning or a general plan or whatnot. So first of all, we are not proposing any zone changes, general plan amendments, changes to the local coastal act or our program. So no huge items to discuss with regard to that. We're not proposing changes to several sections of the code, such as non-conforming provisions, lot areas, oil and gas exploration. We don't do a whole lot of it here, but we've got a big chapter that we're going to leave as is. I'm sure we vetted out our adult business provisions in the past, as well as family daycare, and not proposing any changes to those at this point. We're also not proposing any changes to development standards, such as setbacks, lot coverage, heights, for any of our zones at all. So those sometimes can be very controversial, but again, what we have in place now seems to be working just fine, so we're not proposing any changes. And then finally, with regard to our existing inclusionary housing provisions, which is tied to our LCP, we're not proposing any changes to those. So some of the topics for this workshop, these again are mostly housekeeping items. The first bunch up to the cannabis ordinance I had set for our first, before we get to our first stop. Then depending on, again, how we feel, we can talk about signs, which is actually pretty minimal and has to deal with temporary signs only. Entitlements, and then if we get to it, antennas and wireless. But like I said, we'll see how we feel later on in the evening. So for workshop number 2, when we have our next one, depending on how much we get covered tonight, the first 3 items may already be off the list by the time we get there. But we'll talk about special use permits, coastal development, our PD zone, accessory dwelling units, and density bonuses. So those last 2, again, are based on state mandates that we will need to comply with. And then for workshop number 3 is primarily dealing with code enforcement type issues, and this is where we'll get somewhat out of our zoning ordinance and into the greater municipal code to discuss those. But at this point, we are working with the city attorney's office. We've actually reached out to the former code enforcement manager, who will come in and meet with us in a couple weeks to share her history and her ideas about what we can possibly do to streamline and make our code enforcement process a little bit better. Okay, so getting into where we are here, like I said, these first 2 are just cleanup items. And again, if you're not necessarily interested in hearing about this, we'll move on to the meatier discussion. But these first 2 items, for instance, fences. We've got fence standards located in several areas throughout the code. And to just make it a little bit easier especially for the public to find them, and to help staff not miss something, for instance, when we're approving a fence permit or whatnot, We're just simply suggesting that this first section be combined with other sections. None of the standards would be changing. It's just a matter of relocating these standards into one common area. And then the same with the loading spaces and required yards. It really has to deal with parking, and so we suggest moving these standards, lock, stock, and barrel, into the parking chapter. So if that seems okay with you, if it's acceptable, like I said, if you even want to hear about this for the next few slides, what is your pleasure?
What would you folks like to do?
Move on.
Yeah. Okay.
Move on, meeting into the more meatier items at this point then?
Yeah.
Actually, Madam Mayor,
Yes.
if I might.
Yeah. Councilmember Fig.
If you could, highlight the things that really are of policy significance, and I know it requires you to exercise some judgment as to what those might be, but cleanup items are not of an area that I think that we need to delve into.
Exactly, agree.
So is it possible you could narrow this list down
Yes.
to those things that
Yes,
really
I will
are
move on to those items then.
perfect?
Yes.
Yes, Councilmember
Yeah,
Sharkey.
on these cleanup items, moving things around from section to section, that will at some point require city council action and whatnot?
Correct, but again, it doesn't require policy decisions to be made. And so, and when I mean meteor, that is exactly what I'm talking about, is actually asking you for the policy direction. So if that's your
Well,
pleasure.
just speaking for myself, I looked at these and I have no problem with the cleanup at all, so.
Okay. All right, in that case, we're going to move on to parking then, which will be the first policy discussion for us here. So for the most part, our parking standards are, I think, pretty reasonable and easy to work with. But we have quite a few restaurants coming in, and we seem to be fairly overparked, it seems, for these restaurants. One thing also I've noticed in my past nearly 30 years of dealing with the zoning ordinances and parking standards, it's much easier to regulate parking standards over when dealing with square footage versus number of seats or number of employees and whatnot. So what I was suggesting for restaurants is twofold. The first item would be to simply base it on our square footage as opposed to fixed seats. Right now, we require one space per 4 fixed seats, which again could change depending on the restaurant. For instance, the new Raging Pot restaurant, for instance, that just opened. They completely redid their seating capacity. Plus, we also require one space per 45 square feet of dining area. That excludes the fixed seats, and we have one space for each 250 square feet of non-service area. And usually this non-service area, again, is your storage area or offices or whatnot, and most of the time you can assume that employees are there and they're dealing really with the dining area as well. So what I was suggesting is a new ratio. We could keep it at the 1 per 45 square feet, which is quite restrictive. Simi Valley, for instance, uses 1 per 100 square feet. With a minimum of 10, but that's actually, in the past, working with that, it's been proven to be a little bit difficult. But a median, for instance, could be 1 per 60 square feet, and this would be a dining area. So it would allow a little bit more flexibility in the parking, and also make it a little bit easier for staff as well as the business owners to comply with parking requirements. So.
Yes, Councilmember.
Yeah, Mr. Stewart, if you don't mind. First of all, with parking, I'm reminded of my old friend Rick Cole, who said, in California, there's something like 3 parking spaces for every car, ensuring that no car will ever go homeless. And as we look at the restaurants, I'm trying to think around town. We've got, I'll leave it up to you to answer the question. How many standalone restaurants do we have? Most of them are part of some other larger shopping center area. And even the busy ones, Olivera Plaza, I mean, there's never a shortage of parking spaces there. So should we be looking at this in maybe a different way in terms of the totality of the complex in which the restaurant is seated, as opposed to just singling out, you know, for the restaurant saying, well, you've got to have so many spaces, because the number of spaces is controlled by the landlord that owns the strip mall or the shopping center or whatever, and those spaces are all shared with all the businesses, and some of them don't have the same hours or the same demands curve over the course of the day. So should we be thinking a little more globally in terms of as, you know, as we look at the shopping centers we have, you know, the ones on Channel Islands and right here on the corner, should we be thinking more in terms of what do we need for that whole shopping center rather than for one use within that shopping center?
Well, generally we do. As a practice, we, for instance, Mandalay Village, of course, is our largest shopping center, and right before I came on board, we had actually asked for an updated parking survey from them. And the reason why we do that is it gives us several pieces of information. One, we know who the most current tenant listing is, but it also lets us know who is up there and doing what, and that way we are able to make sure that we do have sufficient amount of parking for all of the uses globally throughout the center. That center in particular has a lot of new restaurants coming in, so it was very critical that we got that parking survey to make sure that we didn't run into a parking situation or a shortage up there. So we do that with shopping centers periodically to make sure that, again, they aren't becoming underparked at that point. But what this would do is at least help us become, at least on paper, have an easier time at staying overparked as opposed to becoming underparked.
So if I'm somebody that wants to open a restaurant and I'm looking at this requirement, what you're telling me is if I'm in Mandalay Center or someplace, I should not have any problem meeting the parking requirement.
Correct.
We're not just setting up an extra hurdle. We're just using this as a management tool to help us understand the demand in the whole shopping center.
Well, again, the parking survey isn't a code mandate, but it's a tool that we use to make sure that we do have enough parking. What this is actually doing here, what we would be recommending doing, is making it easier for additional restaurants to come in, be more business friendly, because we are reducing the amount of parking that would be necessary for a restaurant while keeping the retail parking standards the same.
Okay. All right, great, thanks.
I think that's really valuable as we are here today and now in 2018, and there are many people who are ordering takeout or, you know, ordering through Uber, and, you know, there's so many other ways to get your food from these restaurants than to go there and park and sit, you know. So we're making it easier not only for the restaurateur, but for the shopping center and where these restaurants located, as well as the diners, whether they're in the location or just, you know, picking it up and taking it home. Yeah. All right. Did you have something, Councilmember Fig?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Mayor. I noticed that Rick Cole's no longer with the city of Ventura. He was a new urbanist, form-based code kind of guy, not well received. Yeah, okay. And so I'm wondering, instead of
Santa Monica now, right?
futzing around with individual uses, we just have a conjunctive use provision in the code. And what that means is the ability to share parking based on hours of operation and needs during the course of a business day. And it does require some discretion, and I'll be glad to give you some language. I've done this before. Rather than trying to futz around with, well, we're going to solve the problem on a case-by-case basis by adjusting parking standards based on use. A conjunctive use policy would allow far greater discretion to be able to accommodate multiple uses on shared use parking, and maybe not get down into the weeds as you're moving.
Well, could I get clarification on that? Because it seems like there would be maybe one rule for, like, say, a shopping center, but this could possibly apply to an individual restaurant. So looks like there might be some multiples. Is that how you take a look at it?
That's what it sounds like. So for instance, we have one parking standard for shopping centers as a group, so to speak. And then another would be for individual businesses. And getting into these other ones, again, churches, vocational schools and whatnot, and even the takeout, I'm looking at, it could be either, if they're part of a center, listening to Councilmember Fig, they would have the one overall group setting. But if we did have, say, just a standalone church, we would park them at that standard instead. Does that sound pretty much like what the consensus is up here? And I'd be happy to definitely get that language from you as well, Councilmember Fig.
If I might, Madam Mayor.
Yeah.
I think what I'm looking for here is that these standards come and go over time. Okay, and maybe there's just a general provision that could be added to the code that allows for some sort of flexibility in how you assign parking and the requirements for a given user that comes in and backfills some other retail space in an existing commercial center, rather than, because I could see us in 5 years or 10 years retweaking numbers, and we're not all knowing. So I'm looking for a general policy of flexibility that allows to accommodate uses based on, again, the overall character of the area and how it's being operated. And there are going to be some businesses that have 8 to 5 hours and others that have, noon to 10 o'clock at night hours. And I think that all needs to be factored into what the required parking is, so we don't overpark projects. And so I'm just wondering if it's better to have to gravitate toward more of a overall policy that allows that flexibility rather than messing around individually with standards that apply to specific uses. That would be my offer.
Councilmember Sharkey.
Yeah, that's kind of where I was trying to get to and Mr. Stewart, maybe you can help us out here. If we look at square foot ratio or something like that can be sort of, what can be globally applied, I guess, and how simple can we make it and yet still have flexibility to deal with unforeseen circumstances? I mean, are we, I know you have, you've got a big thick book that tells you what to do. So, are we heading in a doable direction here with that kind of a thought? Is it possible to come up with something that's a little more global and a little more flexible for the long run?
Well, it certainly is, and like I said, I'd be more than happy to take a look at what Councilmember Fig has with regard to his ideas. And maybe what we'll do is we can bring that back at the next workshop as a follow-up to for further discussion, see if everybody's on board with that. It is nice to have flexibility in design standards with regard to that. And I don't want to go into form-based codes, but the nice thing about those is that they are based on the actual situation at hand, and they're not applied citywide to every parcel in the C1 zone, for instance.
Well, we're only talking about parking here. We're not talking about,
Well, but parking and whatnot too.
Building frontage here.
Like I said, at the beginning of this, I'm not recommending any changes to that. So.
Just saying, as I look at what you have here, and basing it on square footage, I mean, I'm fine with that, but I think Mr. Fig's got an idea that, and I'm sort of, it's in my mind too. I think there's a solution out there that's a little simpler and a little more universal.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, us being so built out and not knowing what's, how the industry is going to continue to evolve. This certainly could be something that really helps us out. So. If that's the consensus, I'd be more than, like I said, really appreciate getting that verbiage, and then we can go ahead and discuss it at the next workshop a little bit further.
Certainly, I'm in favor of something that makes it simpler.
Right. Okay.
Absolutely.
All right, then that's probably going to cover this next standard, which has to do with industrial uses, which is also, I think, a little bit cumbersome currently. And so, again, why don't we go ahead and take a look at this as part of the overall process at our next workshop. And then these are just a couple, well, the first one's a cleanup item. The second one has to do, switching topics with regard to number of spaces, but driveways. We actually currently, not that I can find anywhere, have a standard for single-family residential driveways, which can be a compliance issue, especially if somebody has let their driveway deteriorate to the fact that they have nothing but dirt. But the other item, or the other reason why this is potentially important is, as we'll find out in our next meeting with regard to accessory dwelling units and how we park those. I think it'd be important to have an actual standard for driveways to accommodate not only just make sure that they're maintained and we have some teeth to require maintenance, but because again we are going to need to address parking for accessory dwelling units, and it does of course require driveways. So the suggestion here would be if a residence has an existing single-wide driveway, single-wide garage, to allow them to have a single-wide driveway, and then standard driveways, though, for new construction and whatnot would be a two-car garage. The dimensions being the same as our standard dimensions for our parking spaces, which is 9 by 20, basically, for a standard parking space. So staff is recommending that we simply add this text to the parking chapter to require driveways for single-family residences.
Yes, Councilmember Sharkey.
Yeah, Mr. Stewart, I mean, this was always an issue in Ventura West. You've got some non-conforming properties. You got people that don't have driveways even because of things that have happened over the years. So when we set this kind of a standard, are there grandfather provisions, for those who might not be able to meet these standards?
We could always add grandfather provisions. I mean, normally this would make something non-conforming, you're right. One way we could resolve this is to say as of the date of adoption, basically. So anybody who had a property, basically who had a non-conforming property beforehand could be grandfathered in, so to speak.
Yeah.
Obviously a little bit difficult for staff to track sometimes, but not always. So sometimes you look at those properties and you realize, how old they are, and obviously they have been in existence for quite some time.
Yeah,
or we could simply say for new construction and/or additions.
I don't think we're dealing with a large number of properties, but if it happens to be your house,
exactly,
it's big to you.
Right. No, and the goal here is, we don't want to make properties non-conforming if we don't have to. So, like I said, we could add, again, language that either says as of, or we could simply say for new or expanded uses or construction, basically. And when I say expanded, for instance, if somebody adds bedrooms, or especially if they add an accessory dwelling unit, at that point, we really do want to address the parking needs. Or if their driveway has become deteriorated to the point where they need to update it.
Okay, thanks.
Sounds like that request is fairly reasonable. Yeah. Okay, Councilmember Fig.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Although when you get down to terms like has to be concrete, I think the objective is to have an impervious surface for the parking of vehicles. So asphalt, which is, prevalent in these older neighborhoods, do we want to say concrete, or do we just want to say impervious surface so that it allows for options? Another example is that some homes have tire strips. That's not the entirety of the area is concrete surface, but just for the purposes of driving a car, and then you can use turfcrete applications so that you end up having green space inside the strips of concrete. So whenever we get down to these kind of finite terms, I get a little bit, yeah, wait a minute, you know, the older I get, the more gray things are in life. And I think we want to, you know, maybe provide a little bit more flexibility, and that we want to have an impervious surface so they don't park on the front lawn, right? But, you know, to say it has to be concrete and it has to be 100% of the area designated for the driveway, I would look for more flexibility.
Like I said, that was a suggestion, so I'm open to whatever, however you would like to have this written.
Yes, Councilmember Sharkey, I do want to weigh in on this as well, but go ahead. Yeah.
Well, Mr. Figg just got me thinking. We're also faced with increasing regulation on stormwater runoff. So rather than impervious, shouldn't we be encouraging pervious concrete, pervious pavements as a means of controlling the runoff?
Yes and no, because at the same time, you also want to make sure that you're not, for instance, if you've parked on there, you don't want your vehicle dripping oil that leaches into the soil as well.
So it's better it just washes down to the gutter and goes into the sanitary,
Into the ocean.
storm system.
That's a better alternative.
I will let our
Let's
public works
let's just
folks
get rid of
weigh in on
cars.
that, but
Yeah, I mean, that's a question. I mean, now that it's been raised, I mean, it's kind of interesting. I'm not sure what the answer is, but it is a question.
And certainly maybe looking at how you have this written and that all new driveways. So I know in the application, we're kind of talking about the application to this, not any application, but the application to this would be new residences. So are you referring to then new residences with new driveways, or if somebody wants to fix a driveway, then this is what would apply?
all of the above.
All of the above,
Right,
okay.
so basically for some brand-new construction, but as well as if somebody, for instance, had an asphalt driveway and they
Update.
decided that they wanted to replace it, or if it's so deteriorated that they needed to replace it. This is written right now as concrete, but again, that's not set in concrete, so.
So it sounds like you maybe need to do a little bit of rework on this one so that you can include maybe if it's going to be called, if the material is going to be called out in some way, shape, or form, or if there are going to be choices for then somebody that this would apply to?
We could do a few things here. One, I could take the last part of that sentence off altogether and just stop it at dimensions. Or we could talk about giving options for, say, impervious surfaces, and that way there's a variety of those. Or if we want to, delve into it further, we certainly can. But I would think, one of the two options would probably get us to where we need to go, where, the idea is we have some kind of a driveway surface out there. If we take it off altogether, then that way we can address pervious or impervious, because again, materials do change over the time. And with all of the new materials out there, certain permeable surfaces may actually be applicable at this point.
So what's the council's option here? What would you like Mr. Stewart to focus in on?
Well, Madam Mayor, I think we're moving away from a specification for concrete. I think I can say that safely. What we replace that with, I'm not sure.
Well, like I said, do we want to replace it at this point?
We can always come back with options. We love options.
Well, by not specifying anything, it gives us a wide open range of options to work with at that point.
Can we say it should be paved in some way or surfaced? Is that a good word?
As long as we can work out something where it's not dirt, and I would say probably not decomposed granite necessarily, but again.
Of course, both of those are pervious and would facilitate percolation of water into the, okay. I think you got the message. The other thing is, I don't see anything here about permitting. Are you anticipating permit requirements for putting in a driveway or repairing it or replacing it?
Not necessarily. I mean, we could.
Good, let's stop right there.
Okay. We don't require a building permit for sure anyway, and I wasn't necessarily wanting to have any kind of clearances or anything for it.
Okay.
Okay, so was that clear for you, Mr. Stewart?
I think it was, yes. So when we bring this all back with the ordinance, we'll have it tightened up at that point,
Or loosened up,
or loosened up.
depending on one's perspective.
Okay, let's move on.
Okay. All right, so these are a couple of minor changes to our development, well, not development standards, but the land use tables. And these probably date back to when we had a hospital over across the way there, but obviously we don't anymore. So, and most residential zones don't have hospitals zoned in them unless they're existing. I mean, I can certainly think of, again, back in the day, and also, for instance, in Simi when I worked there, there are residential units now that have been converted to hospital support buildings. But in this case, because we don't have that situation anymore, I was suggesting that we simply remove medical offices and hospitals from the R2 and the R3 zones because we don't have them. Our R3 zone is actually all of our, well, most of our planned developments. So it's simply really a cleanup item because unless we would like to have medical offices at some point in our R2 and R3 zones. And then the other one down there with regard to mobile home parks is just that it's listed twice in the R3 zones, and so it's just deleting one of the listings, but not deleting the idea of allowing mobile home parks in the R3 zone.
So R2 is residential, R means residential?
Correct. So R1 is our single family, R2 is basically duplex, R3, and so on and so forth. They get denser and denser. R4 is actually mixed use. So as the number gets higher, the denser it is, but they are all residential zones.
And currently, we don't have any, not even medical offices within the R2 zone?
Not that I'm aware of any longer.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Any comments or questions? No? For that, Councilmember Fig.
This is gonna be a repeating philosophy of, what's driving these changes? I mean, other than you looked at the code and said, oh, this doesn't seem to be a good fit. Is there any compelling reason to be making these changes?
Not in this case, other than, again, it doesn't, from a planning point of view, it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to have a residential zone with medical offices in it if they're not already existing. Now, if we did have them in place, then this would be a different
I'm a
conversation.
fan of, just kind of like the earlier discussion, that we have a provision in the code that allows the citing of these kinds of uses as on a conditional use basis, so that we don't get so specific at each one of our zones, but we acknowledge that these are unusual or special uses that can be cited within any of the zones, providing that public health and safety isn't compromised and blah, 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 what goes into a conditional use permit process. So I'm looking at more of a global approach to these issues where you feel that, the specificity in each one of these zone designations doesn't seem to fit for that type of zone, that we have a catch-all that allows for the citing of these kinds of special uses on a general basis through a conditional use process. I'm trying to simplify how you go about modifying the zoning code. And maybe it's, rather than looking at each of these individual zones designations. That the intent here is that we have a broad list of uses that don't seem to fit any particular category, and that they could be entertained on a case-by-case basis on a conditional use process. You know, it's just, again, I'm just trying to understand what's driving your thinking here, and to provide a little bit more flexibility in how we cite these kinds of uses.
That is definitely one way of looking at it. Now, keep in mind, too, there are actually very few changes to the land use matrices. This would be one of the major ones, because for the most part, they are fine as is. Another way, I guess, we could look at it is if somebody did want to come in with clearly a commercial type of use, such as this, that maybe we look at is the zoning designation appropriate, or maybe it should be changed to a commercial type of zone. Again, that's a little bit more traditional planning-wise, but again, these are suggestions. They're not hard and fast, any of them. So if it's the council direction that we pretty much leave it as is, or at least require, say, conditional use permits for these types of uses. Well, actually, they are conditional use permits now. If we leave it as is, you know, we can certainly do that. Again, I have no real heartburn either way. It's just, again, looking at this from a more traditional planning type of view, but again, allowing the flexibility that we currently have in the code would be fine as well.
Councilmember Sharkey.
Yeah, I think Mr. Figg's points are well taken. You know, if you just look at Port Hueneme in general, where you don't have a lot of, you know, we have zoning designations, but we're not dealing with a lot of applicants doing odd stuff in there. And you know, it's actually probably a more modern approach to have a permissive type of zoning and operating on a if not exactly a case-by-case basis, certainly a conditional basis. And that gets you away from listing types of activities. You know, and in some cities have elaborate, you know better than I do, some cities have really elaborate zoning codes that list plastics manufacturers but not brush makers, you know, and I think we want to avoid that, and just because of the nature of this city, I think, you know, I think maximum flexibility is in our interest. So I mean, I'd kind of go along with Mr. Figg on this. How can we be more permissive and try to stay away from the nitpicky specifics of, well, you fit in this box or do you fit in that box? You know, if you fit here somewhere, we'll find, you know, we should be able to accommodate you with a conditional use permit. So I mean, that's my inclination. I'd like to go in that direction. You know, so.
You know, and I understand it from the opposite perspective, is that you always have to have some kind of rule, some kind of boundary that you set. And even though there could be an organization that wants to do something that would, that we would need to maybe be flexible and change some zoning and all, I think that's okay and that's appropriate. But I think that when, you know, folks move into residential, they expect residential there. If, you know, if we're looking at commercial, you kind of expect to see commercial there and not residential. And so I think by having some rules like this and cleaning up some things are okay. I don't necessarily like the fact that we would just leave it to be more subjective in certain parts than objective. But if that's the majority of the way the council wants to move, then we move on that. I just have some reservations about that.
I guess the one thing, hopefully, to make you a little bit more comfortable is that's how it currently is written in the code.
Right.
And it is
Okay.
conditional, it is required to have a conditional use permit. So we still have enough subjectivity, and of course, we do require bringing it to, you know, the council for actual decision-making opportunity. So hopefully that would provide a little bit of a comfort level for you.
Okay. We'll move on.
But keeping that in mind, looking at possibly loosening up a few of our standards here with regard to commercial versus manufacturing types of uses. And this is primarily stemming from our new cannabis ordinance, but it's also has to do, or could do, with any of our commercial uses and manufacturing uses. So simply put, what I was suggesting that we look at least is allowing, say in the commercial zones, minor manufacturing as an ancillary use to something that would be sold in the premises. So looking at, for instance, our cannabis ordinance, where we allow cultivation plus dispensaries in our commercial zone, but right now we don't look or allow what we call micro businesses, or what the state's calling them. So there's that connection of actually, packaging and preparing the cultivated product for sale on the on-site dispensary. So this would allow us to allow a business owner to do that minor manufacturing and prepare their freshly cultivated product for sale on the premises. On the other end, currently our manufacturing zone, we don't allow retail, and so the idea would be to potentially allow accessory or ancillary retail sale of products that were manufactured on site, basically in that facility. And that would allow us to, again, have a little bit of flexibility. We would also potentially have additional sales tax revenue coming in. There is one caveat, though, or a couple of caveats with regard to that, and that is usually retail uses require a little bit more parking, but again, we've had that discussion where we may be loosening up our parking standards. But the other idea, particularly with regard to our Industrial Avenue site, which is one that was kind of in my mind when we were looking at that, is that our manufacturing zones are surrounded at this point by residential uses. So retail usually will generate more traffic, which is why we generally require more parking and have them in different areas. So there, particularly with regard to the manufacturing and allowing accessory retail, there are definitely pros and cons. But I wanted to basically bring that out for discussion here to see basically if what the council's desire was. I mean, we can certainly leave everything as is, or we can provide, like I said, a little bit more flexibility, not only to our cannabis users, but any type of business that would potentially benefit from these changes.
Any input from Mr. Stewart? No?
Again, this is my mantra about flexibility. Can some of these clarifications be done by resolution? Because there isn't the interpretive provisions of the code, which we've used in part to craft the cannabis ordinance. Do we really need to get to this level in the ordinance itself, or can we utilize that tool to accomplish the same outcome?
I would love to use that tool. I'm going to probably let the city attorney weigh in a little bit too. I think when we were crafting the cannabis ordinance too, we were trying to stay consistent with the existing land use matrices so we can stay consistent with the LCP, so we didn't involve the Coastal Commission. That's a discussion we'll have at the next meeting as far as how we do involve them. I expect you've got quite a bit of input for us on that in the next one because of your history. But I would love to be able to do that. Here, I just want to make sure that we do keep the Coastal Commission happy with us in particular. But if Mr. Green, if you think that we can use that type of flexibility.
Well, I hate to punt, but I'm just hearing this myself, so I really want to have an opportunity to look at the issue before I said. My gut reaction is we probably could, but before we do that, I'd like to, and the truth of the matter is, if we bring an ordinance forward, which I suspect we will, with other changes, it can be an omnibus ordinance, and we could just include this anyway, so it's not any more trouble than doing a resolution.
Yes, Councilmember Sharkey.
Yeah, I appreciate both sides of this. I feel more comfortable having it, as, in the zoning this way, the way staff's recommending. It gives me a greater feeling of security. As was pointed out, being in the coastal zone, there are ways to challenge, and the more I's you dot and T's you cross, the harder it is to challenge, and the more surety everybody has. And I think that's when we look at these kinds of ordinances. I think everybody wants to be sure that they understand what the ordinance says, and so I'm reasonably happy either way, but I have a greater sense of security following the recommendation of staff on this one.
My concern would be is that the community has already heard that, this we've identified, let's take, for example, the cannabis businesses, that they are for medicinal and, adult use, and the dispensary would be there, but it's also, delivery options as well. When we start adding these other things in, I think we start kind of changing things for the community in terms of what we've actually identified could be in the close to residences, et cetera, et cetera. And so I would be concerned to put this in action. I'm thinking about the neighborhoods that that this could possibly apply to, and I would not be in favor of it. So I'm just voicing my concern here. I'm from the fact that if you state one thing, you deliver on it and you execute on that. But if you start changing some other things, says, oh, well, we're going to start possibly increasing traffic and everything else because we've identified that this could be an opportunity for more revenue, et cetera, whatever the case is, cleaning up the zoning here. It gets into that gray area that I'm not so sure we can manage right now. I think it could be something that we discuss then later on, because we don't have a maximum number of how many businesses we're going to allow to do this. I mean, we've let 5 through the gate already. We know more coming through the gate. And I want to make sure that we have all our ducks in a row and we can manage those that we've let through the gate before we start doing this, and that we get feedback from the community. Those are my 2 cents. Yes, Councilmember Sharp.
Just to be clear, we're talking about commercial zoning here. In various uses within the commercial zone, some of them may be cannabis related, some of them may not. But I mean, everything still has to require a permit. And I don't know that I don't see this as amounting to much of a change at all, except for a level of detail from what's already in place.
So, Madam Mayor, my question would be, and if we said, yeah, we don't need these changes, what happens?
Well, at this point...
Because you have to ask that question of, well, what's the downside of just not doing anything?
Well, right, and that's definitely an issue for all of these. In this case, for instance, if somebody, for instance, we have some existing standards with regard to bakeries. And I'm not talking cannabis bakeries, I'm just talking bakeries in general, where our code currently restricts bakeries to no more than 5 employees if they are actually baking on site in the commercial zone. So if we didn't change something, for instance, this would theoretically eliminate that and allow a bakery to a little more flexibility in its operations. With regard to cannabis-type uses, for instance, a dispensary right now, or somebody who wants to do cultivation plus dispensary, would have to have two very separate entities. So they could not have any distribution moving that product from the cultivation area to the dispensary, which is allowed by micro businesses, but we don't have that type of license right now in our ordinance. And so we require somebody in the commercial zone to have a separate distributor come, take the product out, get it tested elsewhere, bring it back in. And so we would continue to require that. Same with the manufacturing zones where somebody cannot sell any product that they make on site, whether it be cannabis or unrelated. Whether it's just somebody manufacturing widgets and they wanted to have, say, an outlet store or something like that, we don't currently allow that, and so we would continue not to allow that per the current standards.
So, do you,
I'm
go
sorry,
ahead.
go
Go
ahead.
ahead. No, go ahead. You have some.
So,
questions.
I think some of these issues were dealt with through our implementing ordinance or implementing resolution, okay, procedurally. And part of the thinking of doing that was not to get into an ordinance arrangement that in fact could trigger Coastal Commission review. So if we start making these kinds of changes, are we not subjecting ourselves to the Coastal Commission's involvement to the extent that these zones are within the coastal zone?
Well, currently, the way that our code is written, and we'll talk about this at the next workshop, there's a statement right up front that says any change to this code needs to go to the Coastal Commission right now. So I am anticipating that unless we could find, based on further discussion, this still needs to go to Coastal Commission anyway, this entire discussion on what we do. So now would be the time to address any changes, which is why I'm throwing this all out here now, so that we don't have to keep running back to them.
All right, let me understand what you just said, is that what we've done to date hasn't triggered Coastal Commission review, at least as it relates to cannabis.
Correct.
And you're suggesting that we have to do that now?
If we're going to change our cannabis ordinance where we start amending the land use matrix, so to
Okay,
speak.
so what you're saying is that your suggestions here would trigger that review.
Correct.
And so I'm going to go back to the question I asked, and if we don't do anything, what happens? Do we have the ability through our implementing resolution to accomplish what I think you're trying to do on an administrative basis?
I don't believe that we do. Like I said, Charlie and I can talk about this a little bit further. But this overall project, of course, is more than just cannabis. So if we leave this alone and don't make any changes with regard to the land use matrix, then it will not be affecting our cannabis ordinance. And any other changes we talk about tonight, such as parking standards and whatnot, again.
Then my overriding recommendation to the council is let's avoid that situation. So to the extent that any of these changes that relate to cannabis would trigger a Coastal Commission review, I'd say no.
That's fine. So that would end up being that we don't make a change here.
Correct.
Correct? Yes, Councilmember Sharkey.
Further question, Mr. Stewart, you mentioned outlet stores, and that it will assume a non-cannabis related manufacturing outlet store. Are we prohibited from permitting that right now?
Double check real quick. I threw that out just there, but let me see real quick. We allow. In general, yes, it looks like we would not be allowed to. We do have a provision for marine supply stores, but otherwise, as far as just a general again, widget outlet store, for instance, would not be currently allowed in the M1 zone.
So that would, I can see a potential advantage to that. In regard to Coastal Commission review, and I don't know if this is Mr. Green or you, let's say we attempt a zone change, or we do this update, an omnibus update, and it gets appealed to the Coastal Commission, they don't like it, and they kick it back. Does that mean that we are just where we are now?
Correct.
So there'd
Or
be no,
they kick
that would
it
be,
back
that
with
would be,
amendments, right.
Yeah, there'd be no change, or they may ask for amendments that we could resubmit or something like that. But
correct.
otherwise, it wouldn't be, we wouldn't be losing anything that we have already.
Correct.
Other than time
Other
and
than
cost.
time and money, yeah.
Yeah, other than time and money,
Right.
which has value.
Which is what we have to make a
Yeah,
judgment
and I
about.
would prefer not to have to go to the Coastal Commission on something of this nature, because it really shouldn't be under their jurisdiction.
Well,
yeah,
and again, that's the topic for next meeting. I'd really like to have your input on that as well, based on your history and what we've talked about, because we're not proposing any changes to land uses, zoning and whatnot within our coastal area. Certainly not the appealable coastal area.
Well, let me suggest we may want to discuss this with our friend in Ventura, our local coastal staff.
Friends?
I use that term advisedly. I wasn't very kind to him when he was down here. But generally, these kinds of zoning changes, they get all the time, and they're just ministerial, and they don't generate a lot of troubles. But, you want to check with the staff first, and if it looks like there's going to be trouble, then we've got a different decision to make. But if it looks like it's going to be just a ministerial sort of decision, then, maybe we ought to, that gives us make a different decision. I think so. Yeah, it's a factor to consider for sure, but I think we need to know a little more information before we can decide.
Yeah, and definitely kind of tagging on to your comment about, the outlet stores and whatnot. One option here is that we could pull the cannabis uses out of that, because at that point, again, that does not affect our ordinance whatsoever. But we can continue to look at, non-cannabis commercial and retail and manufacturing, vice versa. So that's another option we can look at. One thing I did want to point out real quick in the middle too was that we currently require medical offices to have a CUP in our C1 zone, and so I was suggesting that we just allow that as a permitted use, again, to kind of allow us a little bit more flexibility. I'm not sure exactly why it's a conditional use permit, whereas laboratories and regular offices don't require them. So again, it's a cleanup item if that is acceptable to the council.
So going back to then, before the last comment you made, is that it sounds like we could ask the Coastal Commission if this would trigger a review from them. Does that sound like that should be our first step?
Well, Madam Mayor, in general, when we're dealing with these kinds of things, it behooves us to maintain contact with local staff and try to be nice to them.
Right. And I guess, and Charlie and I can talk about this a little bit more too. The way the code reads right now, it says any amendment or boundary change authorized under the provisions of this chapter that affects any use of land situated within the coastal zone as defined by the Public Resources Code basically constitutes automatically an amendment to the LCP and therefore their approval. So I think it depends on how we interpret that. Because we could look at it where anything we do in this code would trigger, again, going to the Coastal Commission anyway. And again, that's why if we do that, let's take it all in one package. But then we could also be looking at it, are changing, parking standards really changing the land uses out there, or if it's just, again, an administrative fix, and does it really require the Coastal Commission to look at that? So we can look at that a little bit further and make a determination and bring that back next time. I was kind of looking at it in black and white.
Well, I mean, the danger of dealing with coastal staff is if you call attention to yourself, then they pay attention to you. Yep. On the other hand, if, you know, and there are cases that came down about they try to change the number of parking spaces at the beach, and somebody appealed it to the Coastal Commission, and the staff says, well, you didn't tell us about this, and then you're in trouble because you didn't talk to the staff. Yeah. So it's you know, on a staff-to-staff level, it's a good idea to just stay in touch with them.
Absolutely. Yeah, keep in mind, too, you've got the appealable versus non-appealable areas. In this city, the only appealable area we have is the beach itself, as well as the triangular piece off to the side there at the intersection of Market and Surfside. But everything else is actually outside of the appealable area, and therefore the standards are much less restrictive with regard to when Coastal Commission review is required or not. So, and again, these changes are not affecting any of the appealable area at all.
So does that sound like a plan that staff will review it, Mr. City Attorney, Manager, and Mr. Stewart, and then come back to us with suggestion depending on what they find? All right. Okay, so move on.
Okay. So this, again, is just a continuation of where we were, so I will move over that. And so this is the first breaking point. Do you want to continue on at this point? The next topic was going to be temporary signs, and followed by entitlements. Most of that's cleanup, but there were a couple policy decisions I wanted to ask you about. So what is your pleasure?
I would say we move on. Does the council feel okay with that? Just get into signs?
Okay.
All right.
All right.
Yeah, Councilman Fig.
Yes, Madam Mayor, thank you. You know, first of all, we have two council people that aren't here that aren't being able to weigh in on some of these questions, policy issues. And I'm a little disappointed we didn't receive this kind of briefing in advance so that we could have maybe had our thoughts better prepared. So my thinking here is that we ought to have this information in advance for each one of the workshops, not only for the benefit of the council, but for the benefit of the public to know what's going to be discussed. And so my recommendation to this council is that we reschedule or whatever, we continue this workshop to a date specific, but we have information available both for the council and for the public to know what the topics are going to be and the recommendations that staff have, so that, you know, they're as much as we are informed as to what the policy questions are going to be. So that's my thinking.
I can certainly provide the list of topics now. This was actually fluid all the way up to early this afternoon, where I was still working on this. So it was a little difficult to get out there, other than the list of topics, which is easy enough to put together. In fact, you do have the list of topics at this point for all three workshops in front of you at this point. So we can certainly reiterate that for the next workshop.
So what's the pleasure of the council?
Okay, so the question is, we have 4 potential dates. I'm okay with any of those, and I believe staff has run these dates by people, and
actually, I think the April 25th and 26th dates could be a problem for both you and Mayor Pro Tem Berg because of your RDP 21.
Well, I'm not leaving until the 28th. So
okay. I thought some of you were traveling on the 28th.
No, we're leaving on the 28th.
Okay.
So that's actually okay. 9th to 10th is okay. You know, that's, I guess staff can work with the 5 council members, and hopefully the Knights of Columbus aren't having a dinner that night.
And hearing back from council members Schnapp and Berg, it seemed like Thursdays were more preferable over Wednesdays, which is why I had the Thursdays in bold there. But whichever works for the majority, hopefully all five. But if those two time periods work for you, go ahead and try to schedule something.
I'm okay with any of the dates that you've indicated.
Okay, so is it, am I hearing then that we should stop here and take a look at some of the other meetings in order to get the full 5, or at least closer to the 5 full members of the council to weigh in on some of these? And being that you've already provided this document to us, this is the rest of it, correct?
The rest of the first part, there is more to come with regard to accessory dwelling units, density bonus, so that still needs to be prepared.
So whatever is going to be the topic of the workshop, I would hope that we can get that out, that information out in advance, both for the council's benefit and for the public.
Well, like I said, the lists of topics are available now. In fact, you have the complete list for all 3 workshops.
Well, topics, but
yeah.
I'm talking about this kind of information, that's the specifics of what you are intending to bring forward in terms of amendments to the code.
You have a chunk of it now, and I can certainly try to get the majority of it, if not all of it, for workshop number 2, and then depending on how we work with Mr. Green's office for workshop number 3 and those topics.
Well, as you know, in some recent council meetings, if we don't have that information in advance, we're looking at having a continuance of those workshop discussions.
Right. And like I said, there was no hurry, but we'll certainly try to get everything in front of you as early as possible.
I like that word, try. And I think that, as you say, you know, we have the list already, and we have a good portion of the second meeting already in front of us, so that's a good start.
Right. And there will be more to come, because we do have a little bit of time here, so there'll certainly be more that will be generated before the next meeting.
The other question I have is the priorities. You've left the best for last.
Exactly.
Okay. Do we want to talk about maybe reversing the order of these topics? Because that one's been, you know, a lot of these are cleanup items and there's no urgency, as you've pointed out. But there are a lot of property maintenance issues that are pending, depending upon the action of this council on how to deal with the ordinance and any modifications. So, you know, would it be advisable to reverse the order, get the high priorities items up front, and let the rest of this trail?
Well, I'm sorry.
Yeah, and, you know, and adding to that is that maybe Mr. Stewart needs the time between now and then to pull everything together. I heard that you might be interested in talking to our former code manager, Tama Fig, and, you know, getting input there. So it sounds like we might need to build some time in before we get to that third
Correct.
workshop.
I mean, originally, the idea was to have that, and heard you the first time, actually, earlier on, to have that as the primary topic. But in discussing with staff and the ideas, again, bringing in Mrs. Fig, as well as working with the city attorney's office and their timing, that's why it's worked out where it's now, again, saving the best for last, so to speak, because that will, I think, knowing what, again, the past history too, I imagine that it's going to be more than one workshop's worth of discussion just on those compliance issues. And so...
Understood.
So,
Yeah.
but we will...
But all the more reason to have material in advance of those workshops, because that will be an interesting discussion.
Yeah, and quite frankly, I think we're going to have, what I'll try to do is at least have a framework for you, but I think we're going to be having quite a few discussion items that come up just on the fly during our workshops that we really need to discuss with regard to property maintenance.
Okay. And so do you feel that the next couple of workshops then would possibly be like 2 hours in length each, perhaps, to budget at least 2 hours?
That's what I'm thinking, just based on,
Yeah.
I think, how much discussion our brains can hold and whatnot, yes. And then what I'll do is I will take a look at eliminating the cleanup items, so we just strictly deal with basically the policy discussions. And one piece of homework I guess I want to leave for everybody has to do with accessory dwelling units. Something to think about for the next item is that per the new state standards, which change every time we turn around, one of them is that accessory dwelling units are now mandated to be allowed in any zone that we allow single-family residential units. And in this city, we allow single-family residential units in all of our residential zones. So R1, R2, 3, 4, and 5, all of them allow single-family homes. Most of our R3, chunk of our R4, the newer chunk along Pleasant Valley, are developed with our master plan communities. And logic says that, say out at Surfside, somebody who owns a condo is not going to find room to build an accessory dwelling unit, but you never know what the state's going to do to us in the future. So the thought here is, do we want to take off the list of permitted uses, at least for the R3, R4, and R5 zones, single-family units? In the R2 zone, we do have quite a few single-family residences, so if we took it out of that list, then we would have some non-conforming units at that point. So again, I'm throwing it out there. We could leave it as is and take our chances with the state down the line, or we can consider whether or not we at least want to eliminate the idea of single-family homes, at least in our master planned multifamily communities. And I want to throw that out there. It's just our multifamily communities, not our single-family ones.
So you're saying to be specific enough to remove the multifamily community from the list where the ADUs would be
Correct.
reviewed?
Right. Right, because, I mean, logistically, again, if you think about the build-out of these communities
Sure.
and where, again, common sense says we're not going to see ADUs out there, but you never know.
You never know.
So
Yeah.
I'm just taking that gamble out of the equation, but this would not affect our allowing them in the single-family and the R2 zone, if we want to continue to allow single-family homes in the R2 zone. I would recommend we probably do, just because, again, we've got quite a few of them already, and we don't want to make them non-conforming. But again,
Councilmember Sharkey.
Madam Mayor, thank you. So just to be clear, in the city of Fort Hueneme right now, in R3 zone and up, we have no existing single-family homes.
that's correct.
So we wouldn't be changing anything other than the allowance for,
Correct.
right? That seems logical to me.
So, anyway,
Councilmember.
again, we can, because this is not actually a scheduled workshop item, I just wanted to give you that little bit of homework to think about, and we'll have that discussion with hopefully all 5 council members at our next workshop.
Okay. Councilmember Fig, did you want to weigh in on that?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Do we not have some sort of regulatory authority, though, in terms of lot sizes and other development parameters?
Currently,
So do we have any discretionary approval?
We do currently, and that's why I'm saying today it's not an issue, and common sense also says it's not an issue. It's the idea of what may be coming down the pipeline in the future, because the state is making it much tougher for us to regulate. For instance, parking, as we'll discuss next time, has basically been those regulations have been taken away from us, so to speak. The state's making it basically much easier to build an accessory dwelling unit wherever a single-family home is allowed, so to speak. So I'm just trying to head off a potential issue down the line, but today we don't have that.
Well, part of the discretion is that, do we have CEQA authority that says that, hey, you're adding this additional burden to our wastewater treatment facility that we share with
Not
Oxnard?
anymore. They have taken away most of our CEQA authority. We can't, for instance, with an accessory dwelling unit, we cannot require somebody to get a meter anymore. It's become a
But
very ministerial process.
the ordinance that would enable the second unit, I'm not talking about a case by case, I'm talking about the ordinance itself. Could we not make findings that would say that this would put an extraordinary burden on the services that we currently provide?
We can look into that a little bit further, but like I said, today we probably could, but again, it is becoming much more of a problem for us to regulate.
Well, I understand the regulation, but if in fact we have authority that says we don't have the capacity to accommodate this kind of additional intensity of development, as we know, we've got water issues, we got wastewater issues. Do we have the potential of saying, thank you, state? Not going to work.
Unfortunately, not a whole lot. And as you probably know, I'm preaching to the choir here, but most of these state and federal regulations look at every community, and every community is unique, but unfortunately, we're all saddled with the same set of regulations. So even though we are unique in our needs with regard and our deficiencies, another community isn't, and unfortunately, we suffer and they don't. So it's becoming very difficult for local agencies to maintain their regulatory authority with regard to these.
Can't wait for that workshop.
So going back and summarizing then with that is that it sounds like we could, if we can exclude then the R3, R4, R5, and just focus in on the R1s and R2s. I think that seems reasonable.
What that does is, by excluding them, that does give us that regulatory authority.
At least something, right.
Because the state says it's only in areas, zones where our single-family units are allowed. So if we prohibit them, then at that point, we are not, the state is not controlling our land use authority.
Okay, that seems pretty reasonable then. All right, so with that then, we have come to the conclusion of our workshop number 1. And Mr. City Manager, you'll coordinate the dates for the additional workshops?
Yeah, I would say try to protect these 4 dates on your calendars now, and we'll contact the other members of the council and try to get the final confirmation very soon.
Okay.
One other quick question, is this format acceptable to you, or would you rather have no notes and, say, larger slides? I realize that the font is a little small, and I actually blew that up. All right, if you're not interested in little note lines, I'll go ahead and put a couple slides per page so it's a little bit easier to read.
Yeah, maybe going to 2 slides a page or
Right,
something like
absolutely,
that.
yeah.
You might want to take into account the combined ages of everybody.
That's why I'm asking the question.
Those with glasses versus those not.
I say that when I'm probably the oldest.
All right, thank you, Mr. Stewart. All right, so let's see what we have on the agenda. So with that, it seems like we will then adjourn the meeting to the next regular meeting to be held here on April 16th, 2018 at 6 p.m. at City Hall. Thank you.
Is there an open forum? I don't have.
No,
No.
there was only one open forum. Yeah. So as we then adjourn, we'll see you all then on April 16th. Thank you.